Although we tend to look at Irish involvement in the American Civil War only in the context of Ireland and the United States, it also affected many other Irish migrant communities, the most notable being the Irish in Britain. Even before the Great Famine broke out in 1845, there were large numbers of Irish who were making both their homes and their communities in Britain. For example, in 1841, there were 415,000 Irish-born people living in Britain. At the time, almost 5% of the entire population of Scotland was Irish-born. The profound impact of the famine on immigration meant that 20 years later, as the American Civil War was about to break out, there were 806,000 Irish-born people living in England, Scotland and Wales, with tens of thousands more ethnic Irish who had been born in Britain. The majority of Irish gravitated to major cities such as London, Manchester and Liverpool, but there were communities scattered throughout Britain where they often found employment in industrial positions. Many of these Irish, whether they'd been born in Ireland or in Britain, were attracted to the United States, and many of them also found themselves fighting in the American Civil War. The topic of this short video is one such individual, John Pendergast. John was born in Ireland around the year 1836, but aside from that we know little of his early life, except that in the wake of the famine, he and his family left for England. At some point prior to the American Civil War, he then found his way to America. John was in New Orleans, Louisiana, when that city was taken by federal troops in 1862. He was one of a number of New Orleans Irish who decided to join the Union Army, and he enlisted in the 13th Connecticut Infantry when that unit was based in the city in September. These immigrant recruits were well regarded, with one of the 13 Connecticut officers remembering, "They were valuable accession to our ranks, many of them being brave men, experienced in war. They were credited to the quota of Connecticut, and few of them ever dishonoured her name." Over the course of the next 3 years, John would serve faithfully, seeing some hard fighting across America, at places like Port Hudson in Louisiana, and during Phil Sheridan's famous Shenandoah Valley campaign in Virginia in 1864. He was discharged from the army in August of 1865, and after that, it wasn't long before he headed back across the Atlantic. Though we don't know what county John Pendergast came from in Ireland, we do know that even though he had the opportunity, he didn't want to return there. Instead, he wanted to return to the Irish community he called home, and that was on Tyneside in the northeast of England. In the 1850s, 8% of the population that made their homes on the banks of the Tyne had been born in Ireland. Shortly after his return to England, John married fellow Irish immigrant Margaret Lydon, and in 1871 the couple celebrated the birth of a daughter, Mary. During these years, John worked as a labourer mason between North Shields and South Shields, just across the river. Margaret passed away in South Shields in 1881, and 8 years later John married once more. Again, he chose an Irish immigrant, this time Catherine McAnally, who was the widow of a man named Callahan. Though the church in which they did so was demolished in the late 20th century, there is still a place of worship that bears the name in North Shields today. Aside from a brief period in Glasgow, John and his family spent the majority of their time living right on the waterfront at North Shields, part of a landscape that was dominated by industries such as coal production, fishing, and shipbuilding. We can trace him through documentation such as the census returns, for example here, which shows he and Catherine living at 4 Bell Street in 1891. This is the approximate location of that house, which no longer exists. It was a street John spent decades on, and one that was familiar to many of the North Shields Irish community. Directly opposite John's house was the Fish Quay, which remains an important base for fishing boats in the North Sea. The quay, built in 1870, still survives today, and would have been as familiar to John Pendergast as his own home. Though there is much regeneration along the North Shields waterfront, the area still retains elements of its past that would have been familiar to its 19th century inhabitants. John spent much of his working life in the shipbuilding trade, particularly at nearby Smith's Dock. While there, he suffered a number of serious injuries, which he later recounted. On one occasion, he remembered, "I was lifting a heavy bar and the weight was too much for me, and I was severely strained." An injury that caused lifelong trouble to his hip, meaning he couldn't lift heavy weights afterwards. In another incident, he and another man were lowering a load from a crane when the crane man released too soon, propelling John into the air, smashing him down on his wrist, which was permanently damaged. Though Smith's Dock is also an area undergoing major development at present, elements of the work that used to take place here can still be seen in features such as the docks themselves. John Pendergast died in a house on River Police Quay, on the North Shields waterfront he knew so well, in 1901. His remains were taken to nearby Preston Cemetery, where after a final ceremony in the cemetery chapel, he was laid to rest. His widow Catherine survived him for another 10 years and received a US pension because of her husband's Civil War service. When she died in 1911, her nephew was entitled to claim the costs of her funeral from the American government. He duly sent the invoice to Washington, D.C., where it revealed she was buried by famous local undertakers E. Turnbull and Son, who are still in operation in North Shields today. An American military headstone was placed over John Pendergast's grave in 1930. His story is a reminder that at the heart of many Irish people's lives in the 19th century was their community. John's marriages indicate that his Irish identity was something that remained a strong part of his life, but for him that Irish community was not to be found in Ireland, or even in America. His Irish identity was linked to Tyneside, and to North Shields, the place he called home. His story is a reminder both of the contribution and impact of the American Civil War on the Irish of Britain, a group who we often fail to consider when we discuss the Irish story in the 19th century United States. I hope you've enjoyed this short video about John Pendergast. If you'd like to check out other stories of the Irish in 19th century America and elsewhere, you can do so at my website, www.irishamericancivilwar.com, where you'll find hundreds more similar stories and a lot of free resources. If you'd like to support my work, you can do so by visiting Patreon/IrishACW. www.patreon.com/IrishACW.